In The Code of the Warrior, Shannon French, a professor of philosophy and ethics at the U.S. Naval Academy, surveys the warrior ethic of various cultures as revealed through history and literature. She spoke about it recently for about an hour.
And I think we're all on. Okay, are we ready? Okay. Good evening. I'm Darlene Swanson. I'm the Community Relations Manager here at Barnes & Nobles in Annapolis. And this evening we are very pleased to present Shannon French. She is a professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. She is a professor of leadership, ethics, and law, and I find that very impressive. She will be presenting her book, The Code of the Warrior. Ms. French?
Thank you very much. To begin, I was asked to tell you just a little bit about myself, and I would begin that by saying that I'm a somewhat unlikely person to write a book about warriors. I'm certainly not a warrior myself in any traditional sense, and I am not from a military family. No one in my immediate family is currently serving in the conflict in Iraq, for example. However, I've always had a fascination with war and with warriors, and my studies in philosophy led me into the area of applied ethics. When I was a graduate student at Brown University up in Rhode Island, I found myself somewhat dissatisfied studying some of the more abstract questions in philosophy. They were interesting to me as an academic exercise, but I wanted to know their application. This led me into ethics, and more particularly into those questions about ethics that had to do with life and death, where the stakes are the highest. Initially, some of my teaching experience was actually in the area of business ethics. I didn't realize how high the stakes would get there, but I was a little before Enron. But now I have found my proper home. I'm very happy to be teaching and very privileged to be teaching at the U.S. Naval Academy. My students are all young men and women who, upon graduation, will themselves be commissioned as officers, either in the Navy or the Marine Corps. That's very amazing to me when I think about it, and I certainly will be thinking about it very shortly later this month at graduation, when they all toss their covers into the air. These are young men and women who are in many ways no different than I was when I was in college, and yet here they're taking on this awesome responsibility. As soon as they graduate, looking still very young to me, they are going to have others under their leadership, and they are going to have lives that depend on their actions. And thinking about that gives tremendous weight to the work that I do in my courses. I teach a number of ethics courses at the Naval Academy in concert with all of my wonderful colleagues in the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law. We teach a continuum of leadership and ethics courses. They all together build throughout the 4 years at the Academy, hopefully a development of character and ethics that will stay with our students as they go off into their careers. In particular, I currently lecture in a core ethics course that all of the students must take in their second year. And I teach an elective course called The Code of the Warrior, same as my book. When I came to the Academy, there was no Code of the Warrior course. I created this course in order, first of all, to explore this latent interest of mine in warrior cultures. As I started to teach it, however, I discovered that the students were passionately interested in this tradition that they were joining. They wanted to know not only the specifics about what weapons were used and how people fought, but they actually wanted to know the values that were associated with warrior cultures throughout history. And they wanted to know in particular, are these values stable throughout history? Do they vary from culture to culture? Or is there some core of what it takes to be a warrior that perhaps distinguishes the warrior from a murderer that they can find in any culture, in any era? So as I learned from them, I became more and more interested and more borderline obsessed with understanding war and warriors. About 3 years into teaching this course, I decided to go ahead and begin work on this book. Now, I will confess to you that I had an extremely unrealistic vision initially of how long this book would take me to write. This is my first endeavor as an author, and I remember the editor at Rowman and Littlefield laughing when I told her that I would probably be done in about 6 months. 3.5 years later, I finally completed my work and turned in my manuscript, mostly because those with whom I work at the Academy were telling me daily, turn it over, stop editing. So it took me a long while to learn what I needed to know to write this book. And writing this book has fed into my teaching and has hopefully made it much better as well, as I have explored each of these cultures in greater depth in order to write about them, to write a whole chapter on each of these cultures. I have then learned material that I've been able to bring back into the classroom. And the students, with their questions and their challenges, keep me continually interested and excited about this material. There has never been a point where I thought this was not worth doing or when I was bored with this subject, and I doubt there ever would be. Well, with that bit of an introduction, I would like to give you a taste of the work itself. This is meant to be a reading. I'm going to, rather than reading straight through any passages in the book, I'm going to read you a few individual passages that I think work well together. And then perhaps if you have any questions, I can do my best to answer them. And hopefully we can learn even more about this subject together. The first question that I always get from people when they find out that I've written this book is, well, fine, what's the answer? What is the code of the warrior? And I like to point out that, first of all, it is not necessarily an easy thing to answer. I cannot necessarily give you a list of rules that will spell out the code of the warrior. It cannot be codified in that sense. This is because what it takes to inspire someone on the battlefield to do the right thing is not necessarily going to be a list of firm and strict rules, but rather an ethos that will hold them to a spirit or a tradition of honorable war fighting that has much more force than any list of rules or laws. Nevertheless, I have tried to give some sense of what a code is, and this is the answer I give in the first chapter of my book. The code of the warrior not only defines how he should interact with his own warrior comrades, but also how he should treat other members of his society, his enemies, and the people he conquers. The code restrains the warrior. It sets boundaries on his behavior. It distinguishes honorable acts from shameful acts. In a sense, that word restraint is the theme of this book. If there is no restraint, then you have total war. You have the state of nature, what Thomas Hobbes wrote about, the war of every man against every man. The code must, above all, set some things out of bounds. The warrior must be able to say, this far, but no farther. To open my first chapter, I talk about a little exercise I do in my classes. I refer to several of my exercises in my book because they have indeed taught me so much, the responses of my students. This particular exercise I do with them on the very first day of class. And I ask the students to look at a list of words and tell me whether any on that list is a perfect synonym for the word warrior. Now, I chose these words carefully and intentionally. Some of them invoke quite passionate emotions from my students, especially the first one, murderer. Another word, killer, fighter, victor, and conqueror. Now, I don't just stop with asking them whether these are any of them perfect synonyms for warrior. I also ask them why or why not. Give me a reason. Explain. It is, after all, a philosophy class. The why is always important. Now, the answers that I get to me are very fascinating because they show just off the bat, before they've actually gone through the course, their initial raw reaction is that they must distinguish themselves from a murderer. It is absolutely crucial to them, and they are very passionate about it. Some of them even seem offended that I should raise that as a possible synonym. That very passion shows me that there must be something vital about drawing a line between a warrior and a murderer. Here are some brief responses that I've gotten from students in answer to this question. Murderer, no, it is not a synonym. This word has connotations of unjust acts, namely killing for no reason. A warrior fights an enemy who fights to kill him. Very interesting raw reaction. Immediately going to the point about combatant, non-combatant distinction. Immediately saying warriors fight other warriors, trying to put limits, talking about a cause and justice, fighting for a reason. Here are some other responses, all of them rejecting the words as possible synonyms. Killer. A warrior may be required to kill, but it should be for a purpose or cause greater than his own welfare, for an ideal. Fighter. Simply fighting doesn't make a warrior. There are rules warriors follow. Victor. I like this response in particular. Warriors will lose. And the people who win aren't always what a warrior should be. That was a very thoughtful response. Conqueror. A conqueror may simply command enough power to overcome opposition. He can be very lacking in the ethical beliefs that should be part of a warrior's life. Now, these are just midshipman reactions to that first day exercise, and we build from there. So, what about the question that is possibly on some of your minds? Why would you want to encourage midshipmen who are going to be officers in the Navy and the Marine Corps to have a code that will restrain them? Don't we want them to win? Isn't all's fair in love and war? Why on earth would we want to limit their options in that way? Why should a warrior culture want to restrict the actions of its members and require them to commit to lofty ideals? Might not such restraints cripple their effectiveness as warriors? Isn't winning all that matters? Well, one reason, and we talk about this extensively in my course, one reason for having such codes is actually to protect the warrior, him or herself. Now, that may strike some of you as exceptionally oddly focused. When people think about restraining warriors, usually they're thinking about what warriors might do to others if we don't restrain them. It seems strange to look anywhere else. But my focus is actually with the warriors themselves. What will war do to these young men and women that I teach? What will it do to their character? So I would like to point out, as I do in my chapter, that of course there is truth in the inescapable slogan, "War is hell." Even those few who for some reason seem to feel no revulsion at spilling another human being's guts on the ground, or severing a limb, slicing off a head, or burning away a face, are likely to be affected by the sight of their friends or kinsmen suffering the same fate. The combination of the warrior's own natural disgust at what they must witness in battle, and the fact that what they must do to endure and to conquer seems so uncivilized, so against what they have been taught by their society, creates the conditions for even the most accomplished warriors to feel tremendous self-loathing. Now, in my book, I discuss some of the psychology that has been done, the work that has been done to examine combat stress and its effect on those who enter and endure combat. I am particularly enamored, as many know, with the work of Jonathan Shay, who has written Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America. In both of these works, he talks about the effect that combat can have on those who go into it with ideals, go into it with the values that their society has attempted to give them throughout their life, and then seem to see those ideals betrayed. And in fact, his research, and Jonathan Shay has interviewed many of those who've actually been in combat and have experienced severe combat stress. His research indicates that what causes the greatest damage is actually not the mere experience of the violence. We might think that. We might think just the sights and sounds and horror of battle would be enough. And for many of us, perhaps it would be. But in the cases that he's examined, it is actually something more to do with ethics. Has to do with what he calls the betrayal of what's right. Having seen during their time in combat, either someone above them or below them or on a peer level, or in some cases themselves, do something that they consider dishonorable. That is what is hard to live with. And interestingly enough, another aspect that seems to cause great damage is dehumanizing the enemy. We often think that, of course, you must dehumanize the enemy. If you're going to kill them, you can't think of them in that moment as a real human. But somehow, remarkable as it sounds, warriors who survive war and come out the other end intact psychologically, their character still in place, say that one of the things that allowed them to hold on to that character in the horror of war was the realization that they were fighting other warriors, that the people against whom they were battling were in some ways, some very relevant, morally relevant ways, like them, fellow human beings, as opposed to animals, vermin, any other dehumanizing term. There can be some honor in a battle against someone you respect. There can be none if you feel you are fighting someone who is subhuman. It's a very interesting lesson and one of the many lessons learned from Vietnam. In a sense, the nature of the warrior's profession puts them at higher risk for moral corruption than most other occupations because it involves exerting power in matters of life and death. Warriors exercise the power to take or save lives, order others to take or save lives, and lead or send others to their deaths. If they take this awesome responsibility too lightly, if they lose sight of the moral significance of their actions, they risk losing their humanity and their ability to flourish in human society. By setting standards of behavior for themselves, accepting certain restraints, and even, strange as it sounds, honoring their enemies, warriors can create a lifeline that will allow them to pull themselves out of the hell of war and reintegrate themselves into society, should they live to see peace restored. Interestingly enough, a warrior's code can be very far-reaching. It can cover everything from the more obvious, such as the treatment of prisoners of war, to table etiquette. But its primary purpose is to grant nobility to the warrior's profession. This is what allows the warriors to retain both their self-respect and the respect of those they serve and guard. Now, accepting certain restraints does put the warrior at a disadvantage. I think we've seen this most recently in the conflict in Iraq. People have pointed out to me since the book was released that there have been cases such as false surrenders, the use of human shields, and other cases where what seems to have occurred is that those fighting against coalition troops counted on a code. They counted on certain restraint being shown and then turned that against those troops, used it as a weapon. So again, we have to acknowledge this physical risk weighed against the moral risk, the risk to character. Accepting certain constraints is a moral duty, even when it is inconvenient or inefficient, and I would add, or even very dangerous to do, allows warriors to hold on to their humanity while experiencing the horror of war, and when the war is over, to return home and integrate into the society that they have so ably defended. As I said earlier, fighters who cannot say this far but no farther, who have no lines they will not cross, and no atrocities from which they will shrink. Such warriors may be effective. I'm not denying that. They may get the job done, they may complete their missions, but they do so at the loss of their humanity. And a point that I like to stress when thinking about the humanity of these warriors, particularly from my perspective as a teacher of them, is that those who are genuinely concerned with the welfare of our warriors should never want to see them sent off to face the chaotic hell of combat without something to ground them and keep them from crossing over into that inescapable heart of darkness. A mother and father, they might be willing to sacrifice their son or daughter's life for their country. It's an incredible thing we ask of them, but they might be willing to do that. But I doubt that they would be equally willing to sacrifice their child's soul. And I don't think we have a right to ask them that. The code is a kind of moral and psychological armor that protects the warrior from becoming a monster in his or her own eyes. And I'd like to point out as well that this kind of concern for the welfare of the warrior is not limited to ground troops, to the see the whites of their eyes fighters. In fact, there's a particular danger that has arisen in light of modern technology. Those who fight from a distance, the button push kind of wars that we may see nowadays, those who drop bombs from planes and shoot missiles from ships or submarines, they too are at a risk of losing their humanity. The reason is that they may find taking human lives too easy, and they may not feel the same risk to themselves. As technology separates individuals from the rest of their actions, it cheats them of the chance to absorb and reckon with the enormity of what they have done. Killing fellow human beings, even for the noblest cause, should never feel like nothing more than a game being played with the latest in virtual reality. And I think that is a definite concern that we all have. I'd like to jump ahead a bit. The bulk of the book actually looks at individual warrior cultures throughout history and looks at the idealized codes that we associate with those cultures, the visions of a perfect warrior. Now, those codes may never have actually been adhered to by real-life warriors. They often set the bar extremely high so that actual living men and women fall a little short. And yet I think it's very crucial to set the bar that high. It's better to set it high and people fall a little short than to set it low and give up far too much. I look in the book, first of all, at an idealized vision of the Greek warrior. I talk about one of the most wonderful books about war, the Iliad, and two great figures in that book, Achilles and Hector. And the chapter is actually named from a line that one of my students used in class one time. I asked the class, having read the Iliad, which warrior would you like to be? Who would you like to idealize for yourself as the person you'd want to become? And the answer came back, well, ma'am, they always have to say ma'am. Well, ma'am, I would like to be a Hector who wins. So I titled my chapter that, A Hector Who Wins. So in that chapter, you can read about the idea of Hector, what he represents. And in many ways, that is the concept of a whole person, someone who can be both at war and at peace and can move between those two worlds fairly seamlessly. So hopefully there's some insight to be had there, even for the modern context. I then move on to the Romans. Now, looking at the Romans, what interested me most is the philosophy of Stoicism. Stoicism is an extremely demanding philosophy, but one that fits very well with warriors and their lives, because it's one that acknowledges that some things are beyond your control, and that it is up to you to figure out what is in your control and what is not, and to realize that above all, one of the things that is always in your control is how you respond to situations. That maintaining your character and maintaining your honor is always your choice. Again, looking at the current conflict or the recent conflict in Iraq, I've had many people, including my students, ask me questions such as, well, if the enemy uses dishonorable tactics against me, can I not then say that the deals are off, gloves are coming off, they're not playing fair, we're not going to play fair anymore? Isn't that a fair response? And what I usually say to them is, do you really want them to decide when you're going to give up your honor? Do you really want to give that over to someone else? That's something that they can't get at unless you let them. And that's really the theme of Stoicism. that your honor, your character is always yours, and you have to give someone permission to take it away from you. So we talk about old slogans like death before dishonor. What do they really mean? And are you really willing to go that far? The next chapter looks at a couple of cultures that are very dear to my heart, the Vikings and the Celts. Now, I am of Irish descent myself, and I am marrying the descendant of a Viking in a month. So I'm interested in these two cultures and indeed how they interrelate. But in a sense, this chapter is less about how to be and perhaps a bit more about what to avoid. Some of the types of codes associated with the Celts and the Vikings are not easily translatable into modern times. There are some that are helpful, some good lessons about honesty and about living up to your boasts, and also lessons about melding passion and even romance with the activity of being a warrior. But I think that chapter is most valuable to look at the question of revenge and how cycles of violence can continue out of control if you do not have some system for putting them to a close. And so when you read the chapter on the Celts and the Vikings, hopefully there are a lot of lessons learned there on ways we can move beyond the old fun but deadly barbarian ways. The next chapter is actually a guest chapter by a woman who was on my dissertation committee when I was a grad student up at Brown University. And she is an expert on the legends of King Arthur. Now, I went back and forth in my mind a great deal on what to write about the knights, because chivalry has had a great influence on the concept of the code of the warrior. I found, as I looked at real live knights, that unfortunately, many of the tales that I encountered about them were depressing, to say the least. Richard the Lionheart, the king of the Third Crusade, committed atrocities that would make any right person's skin crawl. And many of the knights, unfortunately, were no better than thugs and simply held their power with force. They were indeed might makes right, not might for right. So I decided to, rather than continue the quest for a good example of a chivalrous knight in fact, to turn to fiction. Because when I think about the knight in shining armor, the knight on his white horse, I'm not necessarily thinking of a real knight that lived. I am thinking of King Arthur, or I'm thinking of Sir Lancelot or Sir Galahad. And when I talk to my students, that's what they're thinking of too. Even the Marine Corps ads that show a Marine morphing out of a knight, it's an idealized knight. So what is that image? Why do they want to be that knight? Why do they want to be a round table knight? Well, that seemed to be the question that was most interesting. And so I turned to my friend Felicia Nimua Ackerman, and she wrote this chapter because it is her passion, and I knew that no one could write it better. And if I wrote it, it would be a weak, pale copy. And so I handed the job to her, and she willingly took it. This is a woman who can quote passages of Mallory at a moment's notice, and I think it courses through her veins. So she, I think, did a very good job for all of us of capturing what the spirit of the Round Table Knights is all about by going through the oath that the Round Table Knights supposedly took in order to join King Arthur. What did they swear to do? And more importantly, what did they promise not to do? So hopefully in reading that chapter, you can see why people are still so intrigued by that vision of the Knights of the Round Table. I think Felicia Nimua did a very good job of explaining that for us. The next chapter looks at the Native Americans, and in particular, the tribes of the Plains. I was interested here at looking at the spiritual warrior, understanding that the warrior spirit is always an important part of the warrior ethos. So in this chapter, we understand how various rites of passage can force the warrior to look inside and find out not necessarily if they are physically the strongest, but if they are spiritually the strongest of those who are going to be on that battlefield. And it talks in particular about how rites of passage force you to test your own limits. After that, I turn to the east, and I have 2 chapters that take us to first China and then Japan to look at different types of warrior cultures. The Shaolin monks and the legends about them are fascinating to me. They are very much other for me. And learning about them, I learned a great deal about the religions of Buddhism and Taoism and how they relate to being a warrior. And in particular, the idea that perhaps it's possible to be a purely defensive warrior. It's an intriguing concept and one that is explored in my chapter on the warrior monks. And then finally, among the ancient cultures, I look at the samurai of Japan. When you ask people about warriors' codes, a lot of them will say, Bushido, and because they have read or they have heard about the samurai. The samurai code is unbelievably demanding. And again, like the Knights of King Arthur, it was more ideal in theory than it was ever lived in practice. But looking at that code, we learn a great deal about what a warrior of that culture wanted to be and what they thought was worth dying for. Indeed, that culture demanded ritual sacrifice for any failure to live up to the ideals of that code, even a mistake of etiquette. If you bumped the master's table with your sword, you might have to commit ritual suicide. And that's a level of commitment that is very intriguing to my young warriors of today. I actually do in my class teach them how to commit ritual suicide, but happily none have followed through. Now, in the final chapter, I return to the present. And this is the part that I would like to leave you with today. As I was writing the final chapter, I was thinking a great deal about the events of September 11th and a question that my students have to wrestle with, and students at the Academy for many years will probably have to wrestle with. And that is, what is the difference between a warrior and a terrorist? Well, that's another exercise that I do in my class. I ask my students, first of all, to write an essay explaining what they think the answer is to that question. How do they distinguish themselves from a terrorist? There's a little trick to this particular assignment. When I give it, I don't define terrorist for them. And they generally don't notice. They just start writing. And then I give it a twist. I say, exchange papers, and now write a response to your classmate's essay from the point of view of a terrorist. Well, now suddenly they have to ask themselves, well, what's the point of view of a terrorist? And usually that is the point where they realize she didn't define terrorist for us. And yet I thought I knew enough about it to write the first essay. So they realized that they had very preconceived notions of what counted as a terrorist, and enough to be able to write how they were different than a terrorist. Now, in this exercise, particularly the response portion, I think it forces them to ask, how do you cross the line between warrior and murderer? How easy is it? How might any of us be driven across that line by circumstance, by desperation? And how, if we are driven across, would we ever make it back? I have a student who has the distinction, actually he's now a graduated student and now serving in the Marine Corps, but he has the distinction of having taken all 3 of the warrior courses that I offered at the Naval Academy. I had a sequence of them: the Code of the Warrior, Advanced Warrior Ethics, and finally Knowing Your Enemy. And he was the only one who had taken all 3. I remember him joking that they should have been called Code of the Warrior, Son of Code, and Code 3, Bride of Code. But in any event, having taken all 3 and realizing he was about to graduate and go into a world that was now in the midst of the war on terror, his question was, what happens when someone does cross the line? When someone loses their control and perhaps intentionally kills civilians in combat, or some other act that they consider dishonorable. What he wanted to know, essentially, was there redemption for that warrior? Was there a way back from that kind of mistake? Well, the response I gave him, which was again very influenced by the work of Jonathan Shea, is that it depends a great deal on the response of that individual warrior. Just as a nation must acknowledge its mistakes and look them in the face and say, that was not in keeping with our values, an individual must do the same. An individual who has crossed the line between warrior and murderer should not make excuses and certainly should not begin to believe that the code was naive in the first place. I should never have been foolish enough to have tried to live up to a code. If instead they say that I had a good code, but I failed to live up to it, then I think they can find that way back. I believe that there is redemption. And the main reason I made my students do that fairly creepy assignment about the difference between themselves and terrorists and writing back from the point of view of a terrorist was that they need to understand not only how the line between warrior and murderer can be crossed, but how easily it can be crossed so that they can avoid crossing it themselves. And they need to understand also that it is most difficult for warriors to keep from slipping over that line when they are fighting those who have already crossed it. Back in 1989, my father had a conversation with someone who had fought in World War II, who had experienced what it was like to not only see someone else cross the line, but then, because of that experience, to cross the line himself. And I'll just read you this quote from that veteran. 3 Me-109s came at us from out of the sun. It was one hell of a dogfight. Jimmy Craig was hit and he bailed out. He was up there in his chute, settling down easy, when this Kraut pulls away and takes dead aim at Jimmy. I couldn't believe it. You never shoot a guy hanging in a chute. But that's what he did. He cut him in half. I swung around on that bastard's tail and I picked at him until he bailed out. His chute opened and I watched him floating there just like Jimmy. I wanted to see his eyes, but he had goggles on. Then I shot that son of a bitch out of the sky. My father asked him, how did it feel? At first he said, felt good, with a lot of bravado. There was a pause. My father said, really? Well, you were there. A moment later, with a catch in his voice, the veteran replied, no. Okay, I cried. It is easier to remain a warrior when you are fighting other warriors. When warriors fight murderers, they may be tempted to become the mirror image of the evil they hope to destroy. I tell my students, usually at the end of every semester, about a Spartan legend. Supposedly, when Spartan mothers sent their young men off to war, they said to them, come back with your shield or on it. Now, basically what this meant was to stay and fight with honor, because your shield actually protected the man next to you more than yourself. So to come back with your shield meant that you had fought honorably, you had discharged your duty, and you had not let anyone down. To come back on your shield meant that you were carried back wounded or more likely dead. So it was essentially a statement of come back with your honor or don't come back at all. Now, the point I like to make is that the mothers who spoke this line were not heartless. Far from it. I believe it was a line spoken, if it was ever in truth spoken, from great love. They wanted their children to return with their sense of self-respect still with them, feeling justifiably proud of how they had performed under pressure, not tortured and destroyed by guilt and shame. To come back with their shields was to come back still feeling like warriors, not like cowards or murderers. And I believe that the Spartan mother's message is timeless. Everyone who cares about the welfare of warriors wants them not only to live through whatever fighting they must face, but also to have lives worth living when the fighting is done. Come back with your shield or on it. For many reasons, not all warriors do. Some are never able to leave the horror of war behind them. Their bodies come home alive, but their faith in themselves, their dreams, their hopes for the future are long dead. And maybe if they had been given a choice, they would have preferred not to come home at all. The Warrior's Code is the shield that guards our warriors' humanity. Without it, they are no good to themselves or to those with whom and for whom they fight. Without it, they can find no way back from war. My students are the warriors of the future. And when and if they go into combat, I want them to be able to return from it intact in body and soul. I want them, every last one, to come back with their shields. Thank you. Now, if anyone has any questions, I will do my best. Yes?
My students, my advisees, all have enjoyed your first course and they highly recommend it. So, you know.
Thank you.
Are the other service academies grappling with this and helping their students? Are you aware of any efforts there involved?
Absolutely. I mean, these questions, I think, while they are timeless, they have certainly come to the fore with the current kinds of asymmetric conflicts that we are facing, and the tactics that are not only being used against us, but likely to continue to be used against us. I think the other service academies, some of them do it in courses, and some of them do it as part of their ongoing character development efforts. So it may not always be particularly a course like mine, but I do think that these same messages come through. And certainly it has been my experience that whenever a veteran who actually has been there and done that and seen war speaks to any of the service academies, these kinds of themes come out. And the kinds of warnings that they give are always along the lines that also Jonathan Shea encountered in his research. So, any other questions? Yes.
Address the saying one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Well, I think first of all that terrorism is a word that is very slippery. It is hard to pin down. And I do enjoy that exercise that I do with my students and the fact that it takes them a while to realize that they had probably a fairly sloppy definition they were using initially, and then they had to try to clean it up. But that comment that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter implies a level of moral relativism that I am not comfortable with. I think you can define terrorism. I don't think it's easy, and I think it depends primarily not on tactics but on targets. I think that terrorism has to do with targeting civilians. Now, that does happen in war in other ways, but targeting them intentionally and in a way that actually is calculated to disrupt and to cause terror as opposed to taking down some legitimate target. Now, that is an incredibly messy can of worms to get into, but I actually think we're going to have to dive in and try to understand that distinction. Because, again, there are practical consequences. There are applications. Right now, there are issues of what do we do with those folks who are currently at Guantanamo Bay? Are they warriors? Are they criminals? What category do we put them in? Thankfully, international law gives us some help, but at some point you have to go beyond that into the philosophy of the question. And I do think also if I had a chance to speak to people who are on the underdog side of an asymmetric conflict, one of the questions they would probably ask me would be, hey, look, what else are we supposed to do? We don't have the same kind of technology. We don't have the same kinds of weapons. If we fight back with the only tools we think we have, then you call us terrorists. You know, this is simply a label of the strong for the weak. But I think that is unfair insofar as if they are willing to say there are no rules for war, if they are willing to say absolutely anything goes, I think they have given up the claim to the title of warrior. You can use unconventional methods. You can get creative and still draw some lines and still say that is too far and I cannot kill, those people are clearly innocent. So even if you feel that some are guilty by association, look at the little babies in this audience. They can't all be guilty by association. You have to have some other measure to use. So I would enjoy that engaging in that debate. But I think it's a little too easy to say if you're an underdog, anything goes. I don't think that's going to work. Yes.
I watched the conflict in Iraq with a little bit more than a passing interest because I was a tank crewman, and a lot of the people I served with are no doubt over there right now. And the question I had was, you spoke of the dehumanization of the enemy, which I can tell from experience it occurs. But the thing that's disturbing me in this conflict is I'm watching on television and I'm seeing newscasters and politicians who are not merely dehumanizing the enemy, but because it's so much of a pushover, they've turned it into a game. I watched newscaster on Fox actually giggle when they were playing footage of the bombing of Baghdad. Now, it's not arguing whether or not it's right or wrong, it's war, but isn't there a disturbing trend going on where it's not just the soldiers that are dehumanizing it, it's the people, the entire culture that's behind them?
Yeah, I actually think you've touched on a very disturbing trend. And I think it is the duty of those of us who see the trend, to including yourself, to challenge it and to fight against it, because that path is a very, very destructive path to go down. In my own course, I tried something to deal with that particular problem that I think had some emotional impact. I'm a big believer that people remember things better if you can grip their emotions and not just their minds. The memory is linked to emotion. And what I did was I brought in someone who had fought in Operation Enduring Freedom over in Afghanistan. And he had some wonderful footage, which I assume he was allowed to show us, but he had some wonderful footage of attacks that he had made as a pilot over there, and that people he knew had made. And almost like my exercise where I turned the tables on the students, he lured them in with a kind of hey, I'm a hotshot pilot, and let's look at this together, and let's go woohoo. So first of all, he showed them some of the big explosions, and just as you might expect with any group of young people in that situation, they were going ooh and ah, and look at that blow up. And then he showed some other scenes that were clearly involving individuals and not just buildings. You could see on the infrared individuals moving away and then being targeted. And you could see even that they were now on fire. I mean, and he stopped the PowerPoint, he turned the lights up, and he looked at them and he said, do you all realize that those are human beings? That is a building and that's a person. And he talked to them about how he is having to deal with the fact that he didn't just blow up buildings, he killed people. And that the cheers they were doing, while maybe it's innocent enough in that context, that can't be their overarching attitude. Or again, what have they given up? Another point that we talk about in our ethics course, which I think is a way to combat this problem, is we talked about the suicide bombings at checkpoints in Iraq. We talked about the case where there appeared to be a pregnant woman who got out and screamed for help, and then the car blew up. It was a ruse. Now, at that point, it's useful, I think, to solicit the dumb, basic response that you might get from someone, which is, well, fine, the next time, let's just shoot them. And someone's going to say that. There's always going to be someone who says that. And that person is your foil, because then you say, okay, interesting. So do you really want to become the person who, when they hear a pregnant woman crying in distress, you shoot her? Or, that's your response? Do you really want to turn off whatever it is inside you that wants to go help that person permanently? Maybe there are times when you're going to need to turn something off inside yourself to be a warrior, but you don't want to kill it. You don't want that dead in you forever. So I think we do have to fight that, and if the media is giggling at war, it's not helping. Yes?
Kind of a follow-up on that. It seems like the success of the embedded journalist is going to mean we're going to have a much more transparent war in the future. How does transparency affect the code and the enforcement of the code?
I would like to think that it helps, that knowing that you're being watched, and in some cases in real time, adds an added motivation to do the right thing. I think also, obviously, it makes covering up mistakes a bit harder, and that is a good thing as well, since, as I've said, the way back from a mistake requires acknowledging the mistake. But I actually think this is where looking at the past is somewhat helpful. Some of the cultures that I talk about in my book in the codes that they describe, they talk about not dishonoring your ancestors, that your ancestors are always watching you when you're on the battlefield. Now, that idea was obviously very powerful if you believed it truly, if you really thought that those who came before you were seeing every move you made on the battlefield. You didn't want to be a coward and you didn't want to do anything dishonorable. Nowadays, if that translates into mom and dad back home are watching me on MSNBC or CNN, then I think that motivation is the same. So I do think this is a powerful tool and it should be used for that. Now, at the same time, I think we have to make allowances for perhaps in some cases the reporter will not understand the situation clearly. I do think there's a potential danger there where something may be reported as an atrocity when it is not and may damage someone's reputation. But I think generally more information is better. So, yes.
As I understand Shay's book, he dealt mostly with enlisted men that felt betrayed by their officers.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Do you deal with that in your course about the role of the officer and the people under them?
Absolutely, and you're quite right. One of the points that we talk about is that there is this added burden that is placed on the officer because they are expected, realistically or not, to have some greater sense of what's going on in the situation, to have a bigger picture. And they are also expected to have had more training in some of the restrictions that they have been placed under, some of the restraints, whether that is rules of engagement or the laws of war. So it may be that their enlisted will look to them and say, can we do this? Is it okay to do this? And they can set a tone and make it clear that in this unit, this is how we behave. There's another book that I reference in my work called Obeying Orders that talks about atrocities in war and gives many examples, not only of when they occurred, but when they were prevented. And there's a case described in that book. I don't recall all the details right now, but the part that stayed with me is that an officer was able to stop an enlisted Marine, in this case, from shooting an unarmed civilian, and this was in Vietnam, by stepping into that situation and simply saying, Marines don't do that. Now, that officer has to be someone of a character, first of all, to recognize that that would be powerful in that situation, but also to want to stop that individual from acting that way. So I think there's both the burden of setting an example and not betraying the trust of those who are following you, and also policing them at the same time. It should be 360 degrees. Anyone else? Yes.
Quick one. Fertile, thanks for writing the book. It sounds like an absolutely fascinating and necessary topic to think about, especially now. At one level, I think probably the more interesting questions are the hard cases, not where you have the murder or the warrior or the mistake and then the act of courage, but the thing that's right in the middle that you're not sure which is the right way to go. Do you address any of that or talk about some of those cases?
Certainly. I mean, one of the things that we talk about, not only in my class, but certainly in the core ethics course that all the students take, is that it really does make a difference that you are simply trying to figure out what is the right thing to do in a given situation. In some cases, it may be that, first of all, that good people will disagree, that there are cases like that. Or it may be that you don't have all the facts and later you will realize that you did not do the right thing. Or it simply may be that the situation is so complicated that there are two rights, that there's an actual conflict, or there are two wrongs. I do believe that happens. There's a theory called moral harmony that believes that there's always a clear right answer, and I'm a skeptic when it comes to that. I think real life is messy. So I think one of the points that we try to reinforce continually with our students in all of our ethics courses is that you're going to be ahead of the game here if you're at least trying to figure out what is the right thing to do. If it at least matters to you that Marines don't do that, or that you do the honorable thing, that's already heading in the right direction. Are you always going to get it right? No. And is there always going to be a clear right answer? No. But we'll be a lot better off than if people take what is sometimes, I don't like this label, but sometimes called the realist approach, which is to simply say, it's all fake. Codes are meaningless. The rules are meaningless in war. It's just kill or be killed. I wouldn't want my son or daughter going in with that attitude. Anything else? Okay. Oh, yes, sorry, Art.
Yes, I had a question. In the earlier societies, you talked about the code and how it stood out. Now, would you consider that to be more incorporated with the society throughout history, as opposed to today, where the earlier question they brought up about the difference between what you're seeing as the newscasters and their comments, as opposed to what the actual code is of the people that are doing the fighting?
No, I definitely think that's an interesting question. Our society in particular is so diverse. You can't look at it and say, here we have necessarily a Christian code of the warrior or any other religion. And you can't even say that there's a single culture influencing it. The cultures that I list here, they are all evident in American culture in various ways because we are an immigrant nation. So we cannot look to the past and find a perfect parallel to America, this unique entity that we live in. And I think that there is a value to the warrior in being part of one of those earlier societies where not only was there such a close link between the warrior culture and the culture in general, but frankly, it tended to be an elite profession. It tended to be one that was held up and esteemed, and as it talks about in the Iliad, the warriors get the best of everything. That's not necessarily the case, as you yourself well know. And certainly throughout our American history, there have been times when our warriors have been treated very badly. Obviously, again, Vietnam comes quickly to mind. So I think it would have been better in many ways for my students, they often say this, in fact, to have been a warrior in one of those earlier cultures. But on the other hand, what they're fighting for in this culture has a lot more value than what some of those other cultures were fighting for. I mentioned my affection for the Vikings and the Celts, but they did primarily fight for gold and territory and not for lofty ideals like freedom. So, okay, well, thank you very much.
Shannon French is an assistant philosophy professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. The Code of the Warrior is published by Rowman and Littlefield. Visit RowmanandLittlefield.com for more information.